Welcome to The Call. I'm Jay Sapsford. Today's topic, multilateralism. This December, the U.S. takes over the presidency of the G20, and business will also play a role. The U.S. Chamber will host the B20 to shape the G20 agenda on energy development and digital commerce. All of this, however, comes at a tense moment for global cooperation. Growth is slowing. Fragmentation is deepening, and the U.S. seems increasingly willing to go it alone. But today's guest says the world's largest multilateral group still has the potential to serve as a powerful vehicle for brokering deals. So to my mind, here's the defining question. Why is the G20 crucial to U.S. global leadership? Joining us now is Dr. Leslie Vinjamuri, newly appointed president and CEO of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Dr. Vinjamuri, welcome to the call and congratulations on your new role.
Thank you so much, Jay.
Let's start with the basics. Why does this G20 moment matter, and what should we be watching as the U.S. takes the helm?
Well, it's an extraordinary moment when we all know that power has diffused to many emerging countries, most of whom are in that G20. And it was originally thought to be a more flexible, adaptable, representative conglomeration of states that could come together to really address the key issues in the global economy. And Jay, remember that the United States fought hard to get this year of leadership. And China certainly wasn't hoping that it would go to the United States, but the US really wanted it. It gives a huge convening power, soft power, but also, real authority that comes from bringing a set of very dominant economic powers, countries together and setting an agenda. And that can't be anything but useful in a world that is as globally integrated as it still continues to be.
Now, we have a moment here in Washington in which there seems to be some doubt and skepticism about multilateralism. Why is it in the U.S. interest to embrace the G20?
Well, for starters, there are different types of multilaterals. And I think that there is a lot of skepticism, uh, not entirely warranted in my view, but there is a lot of skepticism about the so-called old multilaterals, the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, especially the Security Council, but also different parts of different agencies that are, heavily bureaucratic, that are slow moving, and that are perhaps underfunded or have overreached some of their original mandates. But the G20, regardless of where you sit on those debates, the G20 is entirely different. It's not a permanent organization in the same way. It doesn't kind of command the resources of its members in the same way. It has the ability to be much more flexible, much more adaptable. It is, only 20 countries, the 20, again, very powerful countries in economic terms. And if you go back and think to, when it really came in handy, it was after the 2008 financial crisis, when the G20 became a really important vehicle for stabilizing the global economy. So again, I think you can pick and choose. It's one thing to be, generally concerned about the World Trade Organization. It's quite another thing to sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater and assume that you can do it all alone. It takes a lot of cooperation to stabilize a global economy and to move forward on key issues, which I think the U.S. has a genuine interest in.
Now, Leslie, we're putting up a chart that to me shows the shift in global power dynamics. You see that today the BRICS countries combined make up a bigger percentage of the G20's GDP than the U.S. The U.S. used to dominate this chart, but no longer, thanks in large part to high-growth economies like China and India. Doesn't this raise the question of whether Washington can still set the agenda in a G20 where its relative weight has declined?
Look, if Washington doesn't participate, I think that's the way I would ask the question. The BRICS continue to gather. Yes, it's a loose organization of states that have very different interests. China and India are hardly best friends. Nonetheless, the fact that they are convening regularly and with a greater sense of urgency, as they are, many of the states in the BRICS are anti-Western. That is not the case with India. But the US, again, not only participating in the G20, but in the year ahead, leading the G20 as the dominant power, might not have the majority, but it's by far the dominant economic power. I think gives it, again, a real ability to influence and shape the agenda that it simply won't have if it works exclusively bilaterally, which is the tendency, I think, of the current administration. There are many issues, whether it's digital, whether it's questions of development, critical minerals, supply chains, that there is just more ability to shape the terms of cooperation, of exchange, if you work multilaterally. And the previous administration, to its credit, understood the value of having that role of sort of owning the G20 for a year. If you go back to India's G20, I was very involved in that. I was a co-chair of the working group on reforming multilateralism. India used the G20 brilliantly, not only on the global stage to amplify its soft power and its priorities, but also at home. It sort of had a traveling working group of G20 meetings all over the entire country. The general level of awareness domestically was very high. It gave Modi a personal visibility that was really remarkable. And it really brought together a set of domestic priorities and global priorities around not only India, but the leader. And this should appeal quite markedly to President Trump and his own style of governance and leadership.
So one of our members is asking, you were speaking about the tendency here in Washington at the moment to work bilaterally, but with the tariffs that were just re-upped yesterday, I'm wondering, does that bolster the case for BRICS as an alternative to the G20?
Well, I think the general reaction to America's use of tariffs, as whether it's a threat or a bargaining tool or an actuality, is to look for other friends, other partners, other trading partners, and other outlets. Now, that's very hard to do in the short term. Clearly, a lot of states, desire and need access to the U.S. market, and to U.S. consumers in particular. But in the medium term goal of many of these states, I just was living in Europe for 19 years, is very much to reduce their dependence on the United States. And a big part of that is the tariffs. It's not the only part. It's clearly in Europe about America's prevarication, or much worse when it comes to security assistance, NATO, Ukraine. But when you add that all up and put it all together, it sends a very clear signal. America is not dependable. America is no longer an advocate or reliable partner in supporting a rules-based order. And it's time to become more self-reliant, more resilient, and to diversify one's partnerships. Now, you could say that's exactly what President Trump would like the rest of the world to do. But it might not actually be in the interests of the American consumer, or in America's long-term interests in setting the terms of trade, exchange, cooperation on all the big economic and geostrategic issues in the years and decades to come.
Well, this raises the question of what some of the other countries in the G20 consider to be in their interests. And here's a question that just came in from one of our members. There are two nations within the G20 that are fundamentally opposed to continued U.S. global leadership and have sought to actively undermine U.S. interests through the support of terrorist organizations and gray zone tactics. What would the U.S. government possibly hope to achieve from engaging in a forum with such states?
Look, there's no doubt the G20 is a phenomenally complicated organization for exactly the reason that person has raised. But you could take very different views towards engaging, or at least cooperating, or at a minimum just talking to those that you sit on the other side of the fence with, but have some overlapping and common interests with. And it's better, in my view, to keep your adversaries, your enemies, those who you are competing with, keep them close, stay in the conversation circle. The G20 is, again, back to that original point, it is flexible, it is adaptable, it does not require anything of its members, of its participants. So in some ways, it's a weak form of multilateralism, but for those who don't want to be bound and are very deeply and rightly wary of other members, it is, the best possible solution in a world that is very fractured, again, where, China and the US are hardly aligned. Where even getting some of the participants and members of the G20 to turn up is not necessarily likely, but um, continuing to talk and getting as much information as possible about the direction of travel in those other participant states is, I think, inherently valuable.
So you touched on the complexity of this institution. I've noted that in the years past, one of the times when the G20 has been effective when it's responding to a crisis. We talked about the financial crisis. I remember being in Tokyo, being one of the people responsible at an investment bank in implementing some of the rules that were then suggested by the 2009 Pittsburgh summit. That proved enormously effective in stabilizing the markets over the next following years. And we could begin the process of a long, slow recovery. Can the G20 be effective absent such a crisis?
Well, the thing is, Jay, as you know, you don't know when you're going to have a crisis. It's almost you can sort of guess. There are certainly people that spend their lives dedicated to trying to predict when we're going to land in a global crisis. But what you don't want to do when you have a crisis is start working out, who to call and how to get hold of them and who should be in and who should be out. You want an organization, you want an informal, flexible organization to be able to turn to where there's already a conversation and a mechanism in place. And the G20, again, in today's global economy, is very good for that. Will it make the kind of progress that it made after the financial crisis? No, things have been slow and bumpy. But if you go back again to India's leadership of the G20, there were some good things that came out of that, not least from the point of view of Africa, the fact that the AU became a member, which is absolutely critical. But advancing the agenda when it came to digital cooperation, the focus on the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, which of course became stalled in the aftermath of war in the Middle East, but nonetheless is still there as an initiative to invest in exchange and infrastructure is critical. And I guess, Jay, the other thing we haven't touched on, which I think is critical, China, as we know, has made significant inroads across many parts of the developing world, the so-called global south. The United States has not fared well. There have been multiple initiatives coming out of the G7 in particular, but the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, a major initiative of the Biden administration. President Biden wasn't able to deliver very significantly on that. China has moved in, it's moving in now. And again, if the US uses the G20, there should be other vehicles, but to demonstrate that it has a position, a set of preferences on the big global questions, trade, supply chains, digital technology, artificial intelligence, it can really choose. And, this should be delivered on a platter to President Trump, who can choose what the key issues should be, what the terms should be for cooperation with key members in the global south, and especially states that have inroads to other developing countries that are not in the G20.
That raises a very fascinating question. One of our members is asking, now, South Africa's presidency was focused on such things as climate finance or debt relief. What might be a theme the U.S. might pursue that we might hope to keep the United States in the fold, like a unifying framework that might be in Washington's interests? And the member further says, dare we venture that G20 might be a good venue to reboot trade rules and norms?
Rebooting trade rules and norms probably won't be at the top of the ledger for a Trump-led G20, although it might,
Hmm.
in the sense that we already know what Trump's view is, which is, those bilateral trade deficits need to get as close to zero as possible. But I think that the Trump administration can very usefully talk about questions of critical minerals, supply chains, artificial intelligence, and digital. I mean, there is plenty of interest, certainly across the U.S. electorate. There's going to be a huge need to work with other members of the G20 on some of these key issues. And again, even though China is, of course, part of this, I think if you look at the G7 and you look at the G20, they're both critical. The G7 is an easier ask and shared values for the most part, although that's become more complicated. Um, but as again, to quote India's Foreign Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, who said, look, the world at some level has passed the G7 by, that if you want to go to where the real activity is taking place globally, go to the G20. I cannot stress enough, it's in the US interests to lead on global economic issues. And this is a gift that's been handed to President Trump, to take this platform, use it as he will, use it domestically, use it globally, without being unduly committed in a way that clearly President Trump doesn't not wish to be overly committed when it comes to states beyond America's borders.
Now, you called this a gift, a failure to accept that gift. Here's a question from our member. Beijing has suggested the U.S. trade policies are antithetical to G20 principles. Do the renewed U.S. tariffs open the door to greater Chinese world leadership?
Sure. I mean, this is what everybody is noticing, that China has used this moment. It's clearly using this moment domestically for a variety of reasons, some of which are self-interested, but nonetheless driving forward its focus on the energy of the future, on really transitioning its economy. But globally, it's moving right into those areas where the US is moving out. It was already there, but as it's seen, the US pull out of projects that US aid and others were supporting China's moving in quite tactically, and certainly has been for quite a long time trying to have influence through the United Nations and many of the key agencies. But I think again here, there's a lot to be won by the United States. I'm not a believer that people, especially states in China's own neighborhood, wish to be subject to China's leadership. They are wary of the domestic governance, of some of the values, of the style of engagement. Most states, that we found in our, vast tour of the world that I led on last summer to 9 different countries on 3 continents. What we found time and again was that countries do not wish to choose. They don't wish to choose between the United States and China. But if the US doesn't have an offer, doesn't have a value proposition for engagement at some point, and China does, at some point that becomes much more difficult, that balancing, that desire, that quest for strategic autonomy that so many middle powers have, and small states,
Okay,
becomes harder.
I'd like to sort of end on a question here that asks, what does leadership look like when the old rules-based system is contested, but no new consensus has emerged? I mean, are we looking at a multipolar world in the making, or are we just looking at a hot mess here?
It might be the latter moving towards the former. I would insert an additional term, which is about multiple alignments, which is not exactly the same as multipolarity, right? States are now seeking to diversify their alignments, not to be on one side or the other. Diversifying their partnerships is a way of hedging
Mm.
against two, very uncomfortable positions. But we are undoubtedly in a moment of, probably quite radical transformation of the international order. But I guess we used to be in a moment where we were incrementally adapting it, trying to change it, certainly changing America's position. And now it feels like we're in a moment of disruption, sometimes bordering on demolition. But I am certain that, if we were to have our crystal ball, move far into the future and look back, we're probably in the middle of a 2-decade period of reorienting, rebuilding, rethinking the rules that are going to guide the next period of international affairs. But it's uncomfortable in the meantime getting there for many people, many states, many businesses, undoubtedly.
Well, I think that's a call for all of us to fasten our seatbelts. It's definitely something to watch closely in the months and years ahead. For now, Dr. Leslie Vinjamuri, President and CEO of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, our audience has gotten their shot of informational espresso and is ready to tackle the day. Missed a live episode? Catch the replay on our website, LinkedIn, or on YouTube. You can also listen to the call's podcast edition on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you to our members for joining us. This has been The Call, brought to you by the Global Intelligence Desk, asking the right questions to navigate uncertain times.